chat anywhere, and Bobby, Joseph, and I will answer all of your questions. Joseph, I'm starting with you on this. I'm wondering, what do you think the police have? And I know this is speculation. There's been some reporting out there that there was DNA evidence in this case that led authorities to Bryan Kohberger to identify him as a suspect. What do you think it was that possibly led to a DNA profile in this case?
Well, if what is being reported is accurate, my estimation, it's going to be a combination of things. First off, they would have found certainly a copious amount of blood at the scene. The question is, was it commingled with the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator's blood or any other kind of body fluids that might have been left around? You got to keep in mind, blood is not the only source for DNA-rich evidence. Another piece to this is going to be anything that was found on the bodies. And, we go back to the hands being bagged, which is a common practice in my field to retain any kind of trace evidence. If there was anything contained beneath the fingernails, and we have to keep in mind, that's not simply skin. You can also find blood from a perpetrator beneath the fingernails as they're being raked away. And I think finally, whatever kind of tiebacks there might be in that vehicle, I think the vehicle is huge, because if he had allegedly been in that house and had committed these crimes, and I think admittedly he would have been super saturated in blood, that evidence would have transferred into the car somehow, and not just the blood, but any kind of other trace evidence he's taken away. So they've got this is an evidence-rich environment, and it will have been inoculated with everybody's DNA that was at the scene.
Bobby, we are moving forward in this entire process. The extradition hearing is scheduled for 3:30 Eastern time today, where Bryan Kohberger's attorney told me he will waive extradition so he can come back here to Idaho. The question is, how are they going to get him back here, and how quickly will that happen? What do you see happening?
Well, that's a tough question, because logistically there are a lot of moving parts in this, and each case is handled a little differently. So the only issue in Pennsylvania is he the Bryan Kohberger that's named in the Idaho arrest warrant? That's the only issue. This is not an evidence thing. This is not a guilt thing. It's only the only argument is he the same Bryan? Is he the same person that's named? If he is, he has to go back. So that's why they often waive extradition, because it's only an identity hearing. It's only, are you the same person that's named in the warrant? And almost always they are, right? And so he knows even if he has an extradition hearing, he'll lose and be removed. But he'll waive extradition. They'll have that hearing. There'll be an order to remove him from the jurisdiction of Pennsylvania, and then the detectives will either get him on a bus or get him on a plane and fly him back to Idaho, where, as you heard the family attorney say, he'll have an initial appearance where he'll get an attorney assigned to him, either a public defender or a privately retained counsel, and then that counsel will ask the judge for a few days so he can review the charging instrument that they charged him with. Now, there are 3 charging instruments: an information, a complaint, and an indictment. And so far, he's probably been charged under a complaint or an information, because to get an indictment, you have to seat a grand jury. That grand jury has to spend time getting evidence presented to it and then vote on an indictment. So I think that will come later on. But initially, I think they'll put him on a plane. They'll transport him to Idaho, where he'll have that initial hearing, hopefully, maybe later this week, where he'll get his attorney attached, and then the attorney will request some days to review some of the material.
And I should mention, too, that Bobby Ciccone is also an attorney, so he can talk with us about the legal aspects of this, too, what we will see moving forward. We are taking your questions, as I mentioned earlier. Submit them to us on Twitter, Twitch, in our YouTube chat, Facebook. We will get to them as soon as we can. Our first question from Twitter comes from @JusticeBrant. Would be interested to know when the flight ticket was bought for the dad to go to Idaho, before the murder or at the last minute. I'm going to take this question, and then Bobby, I'll ask you about this as well. I had spoken with Jason Labar, Bryan Kohberger's attorney, on Sunday, and he told me that Bryan Kohberger's father flew from Pennsylvania to Washington to then drive the white Hyundai Elantra back to Pennsylvania. This was a trip, he said, that was planned before the school year started, so they would drive back together for Christmas. So we don't know when that plane ticket was actually purchased, but we do know that it was planned in advance, according to Jason Labar, the public defender representing Bryan Kohberger in Pennsylvania. But Bobby, I'm going to ask you this. Does when Dad purchased that plane ticket matter at all? The parents have said in a statement that they are cooperating with law enforcement and that they're shocked by this.
It wouldn't matter to me as an investigator. If I was an investigator on this team investigating this homicide, the dad is an ancillary character in this. Some people might think he might be an accessory, but that's not germane to me. If I'm looking to convict someone on these 4 homicides, I'm looking at a person now. I have to focus all my efforts to make sure we can obtain a conviction in court. And so I have to make sure all of that evidence is ripe and proper, and all the white noise of prior bad acts by the defendant or other people that might have helped him. Other teams can start looking at that, but there has to be a focus now because charges have been lodged in murder, and so we want to get a conviction of this guy in murder. If somebody helped him, if the dad was involved, that can sometimes come later. Those are charges that would probably be tried separately anyway, if in fact they do get charged. But right now, the focus of the investigators has to be on this crime scene, these victims, and this suspect, this defendant now in trial.
And that's most certainly what the focus does need to be. And everything we've heard is that the parents, as I said, were shocked by this arrest. We're going to go on to a question now from a Gerst Kitty. And Bobby, I probably should throw this one to you, but I'm interested in what Joseph has to say about it as well. Any chance he decides to represent himself like a Darrell Brooks situation? Of course, we know, Bobby, that this is a criminology PhD student studying criminal justice. Into the criminal mind, he knows how the system works. Do you foresee that at all, that this Bryan Kohberger would try to represent himself?
Well, I mean, look, it's very rare that happens. And yes, we did have the Brooks case this year in which that did happen, or last year now, in which that did happen. And it's fascinating for us always to get that insight because we very rarely ever hear from a defendant in a murder case. They very rarely take the stand and they very rarely represent themselves. Now, that being said, if this guy is such a narcissist that he wants to use this platform to get his voice out there and to get all the attention, then he might choose to do that. Everybody has the right to defend themselves. They have a right to stand up before the court themselves and defend themselves. It's not very advisable, particularly if you're not versed in the law and how a courtroom works and how trials work. So I don't know. I don't see him doing that, but it's always unusual when a defendant does that, but it does happen. I always think it's a mistake when a defendant chooses to do that, and so do most legal people. But it's possible. It depends on what level of narcissism he's currently harboring.
And of course, he maintains his innocence, saying he hopes to be exonerated of this. He has rights just like every other criminal defendant does. And we just saw just in the last 30 seconds or so, there was video that we have from News Nation where they caught Bryan Kohberger being led into the Monroe County courthouse for that extradition hearing. Hours ahead of time, of course. There are security concerns here, so I don't find it unusual that they brought him in so early for that hearing. Joseph, I want to talk to you about just the personality of this guy. I know you're a forensic death investigator. You're looking at clues at the scene. But we've heard some rumors that this was a sloppy scene. We don't know that for certain. But what do you see from this guy? He's a criminology student, a criminal justice major. We know about that survey that was online on Reddit where he was seeking information for research. What are you thinking about Bryan Kohberger as a defendant, what we know about him so far?
Well, I think going back to the earlier comment, the previous question, I think that there's a tie back here. There are people that are out there that are conflating the study of criminology with the study of forensic science. And nothing could be further from the truth. Yeah, we cross paths with behaviorists all the time. However, that doesn't make you an expert in crime scene investigation. As a matter of fact, he probably knows very little at all about the process of working a scene and certainly processing the evidence and what we're specifically looking for when you get down into the details. And this case is all about details. And we're going to look in places that he probably thought about, but some places he didn't think about. And my colleagues that are still actively working in the field will dig deep into this. And this is where they're going to harvest everything from. So, this is the interesting part to this. He can go and he can seek out knowledge in an academic setting, okay? But an academic setting is not an applied setting, all right? So he can go and he can sit and learn at DeSales with my friend Catherine Ramsland. He can sit in her classroom and he can learn from her, certainly, I would imagine. But that doesn't make him a behaviorist. He's just sitting there learning. And how he applies that knowledge is anybody's guess. To my buddy Bobby's comment about being a narcissist, roll the dice, see how it works out for you, because it's not going to work out well for you if you try to represent yourself in this case. And just like I don't think it's worked out well for him if he attempted to make any alterations at that scene or pick up after himself, they're always going to miss something.
Most definitely. They say you leave something everywhere you go. And I think it would be very difficult to enter a scene, to enter any place like that, take part in possibly, something this violent and not leave something behind. We're going to take one last